Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
There's a big mistake many dentists make when they're trying to stimulate practice growth. And explaining this problem takes a little bit of doing, but it looks something like this. Let's say we have Dr. A. And Dr. A's practice collects about $90,000 on average per month and sees an average of 30 new patients every month. So Dr. A calculates the revenue he makes from his new patient traffic, these 30 new patients, and it averages about $40,000 per month. So he's collecting 90 overall, and 40 of that 90 is coming from this average 30 new patients that he sees every month. So Dr. A, again, does the math because he wants this practice to grow. And he says, well, gosh, if I'm collecting $40,000 from 30 new patients, if I were to increase that to 60 new patients, an additional 30, I should make another $40,000. So instead of collecting $90,000, I'd be collecting $130,000. So he goes through all the motions in order to attract 30 more new patients per month. He pays for the marketing, whatever marketing he might be doing. But then when all is said and done, he gets those extra 30 new patients a month. Now he's seeing 60. He only sees a marginal increase in overall revenues, maybe $5,000 or $10,000 a month. Maybe it doesn't even cover the money he spent on the marketing. So what happened? And why didn't he see the expected increase in revenue? Well, it's a variation of what's called the Law of Diminishing Returns. It's a basic economic principle. And that's what I want to talk about in this week's episode. I want to cover how this happens in a dental practice because it happens a lot. It might be happening to you right now. It confounds a lot of doctors' expansions. They can't expand the way that they want to expand. And more importantly, what I want to get into is what to do about it so as to keep your growth constant. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And this doesn't just apply to new patients, folks. We see it with adding hygiene days, or especially adding an operatory or a couple operatories, or a piece of heavier equipment, expensive equipment, with the idea, well, if I buy X equipment, my numbers should go up. Or if I add an extra chair, my numbers should automatically go up. We've seen people move their office with this idea and spend, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 on build out with the idea that that's magically going to make their numbers go up. And that's all the same thing. It all falls under this heading, this law of diminishing returns. So what is this law of diminishing returns? Well, I've got a pretty simple definition here because I don't want to get into a whole economics talk, but I want you to be able to think with this. This comes from Investopedia, which is a nice site for basic investing terminology, but I'll read it to you. So it says, the law of diminishing returns is an economic principle that states that as an investment in a particular area increases, the rate of profit from that investment cannot continue to increase if other variables, we'll talk about these, remain constant. I'll read that again. The law of diminishing returns is an economic principle that states that as an investment in a particular area increases, the rate of profit from that investment cannot continue to increase if other variables remain constant. In other words, the same. In other words, the effectiveness of each additional unit of input decreases. So let's take this concept for a second, all right? And that's all I'm going to read from this. I'm not going to get into a huge economics thing. And let's apply it to that example that I just gave you. So we have Dr. A, who's getting 30 new patients, wants to up it to 60 so as to increase his collections or revenue. So what we'll call the new patients here an input into the practice. That makes sense, right? New patients coming in. But what are the variables? Because, it mentioned that it cannot continue to increase if the variables remain the same or constant. So what are the variables? Well, what does it take to translate a new patient? And again, obviously, I'm looking at this from strictly a business perspective, okay, folks? I'm not saying new patients are money, but obviously it's going to increase your revenues if you do what you're supposed to do with them. But what does it take to actually turn that new patient, that person who doesn't know you, who just walked into your practice, into a patient of record who's actually purchased a considerable amount of treatment from your practice? Well, a lot of steps go into this. New patient comes in. Maybe you run your new patients through your hygiene department. All right, well, the hygienist has to have time in order to see this new patient and actually spend time building rapport, right? You as the doctor have to do an exam and, deep, thorough examination of the patient, and you have to make sure that you chart everything exactly the way that you want. And then you have to spend a bit of time with this patient in order to explain their treatment plan. You have to have time for this, right? And then your treatment coordinator has to do the same thing, and the patient has to then, pay and end up on the schedule. So in this case with Dr. A, the way his organization was set up, that worked fine with 30 new patients, maybe with slight variances, 25, maybe even up to 40. That didn't break the machine. These other points in the organization, the treatment coordinator, the doctor's time, the treatment coordinator's time, the hygienist's time, all of these things we could call variables because we didn't increase the doctor's time. The doctor didn't magically get an extra 10 hours a month to spend with these additional 30 new patients. Neither did the treatment coordinator, neither did the hygienist. So we take this practice that was doing just fine on 30 new patients a month, pour another 30 in there. Now the doctor is finding Dr. A doesn't have as much time as he used to have with patients. He feels like he's running a bit. He isn't spending as much time during the sales process with case presentation because he just doesn't have the time. And he's turning it over to the treatment coordinator a lot earlier than he used to. He isn't having the time to answer the patient's questions. The hygienist is running into the same problem. As a matter of fact, hygiene's getting so busy that maybe some of the days are now assisted hygiene. So the hygienist is running from room to room because we've poured all these extra patients in the practice, and the treatment coordinator has the same problem. Whereas in the past, they maybe had a little bit of time that they could spend with a patient to really make sure that they understood what their financial options were and run them through all of them. And maybe a patient who was balking a bit went ahead with treatment anyway. Well, now he or she does not have that time anymore. That's one factor, is the time. We didn't increase that variable of how much time the various providers have. That remained constant while we poured all these extra new patients in there. And another funny thing happens with this as well. I've seen this happen especially in the sales game. I've done a lot of sales training. Let's say we have a salesperson and we're giving this salesperson, 40 prospects to sell to per month, 40 new prospects, which in some businesses that would be hardly any, and in some that would be a lot, depending on the size of the sale, right? But they're getting 40 prospects per month, and they're pretty successful salesperson. They're doing a good job. And they're very careful with their prospects because they know they only have 40, so they really can't waste them. Obviously, if a person turns out to not be a valid prospect, they move on. But for the most part, there are many steps they run each prospect through before they either close or they decide this is not worth selling anymore. All right. Now we take this salesperson and we give them 140 prospects per month. They were getting 40. Their systems were in place to handle the 40 that they had. Well, now we're giving them 140. All right. Well, a couple of problems erupt at that point. The salesperson doesn't have the time to work those 140 prospects like he was working the 40 that he used to get. So a few things happen. One, he stops spending as much time with each prospect as he used to. And what we call his waste factor begins to increase. So I have a prospect that maybe I would sink an hour into this prospect. Let's say if I were this salesperson, to make sure that this person was a valid prospect. And if they weren't, I would move on. I'm not going to try and, beat a dead horse, right? But now I don't have that hour anymore. I have a half hour. And plus I have 140 prospects now instead of 40. So what's the big deal? I don't need that guy as much as I needed him last month because I only had 40 last month. You getting the idea? In other words, because the prospects are so plentiful, I'm more willing to waste them and not put the effort in that I needed to put in to actually turn them into a valid prospect or close. And that happens. It takes a very special person to not do that. And this is something that I've seen play out for years. You take a salesperson, you dump more prospects on them. In most cases, it doesn't equate to the same increase in closes that they would have got as a percentage of the prior amount. So maybe they were closing 5 out of 10, you give them 20. They don't close 10 out of 20, they close maybe 7. You'll see a slight bump, but not an equivalent bump. It takes a very special person to be able to pull back and go, well, wow, I'm getting 140 prospects now. How can I make sure that I handle this 140 prospects with the same level of quality that I was handling the 40 that I used to get? People who do that innately are few and far between. This is not your average person. So you might have some of that going on too. If you're dumping 60 new patients in this practice, whereas you used to dump 30, it's not as important to go through all the motions like we did with the 30 new patients because we have 60 now. So what's the big deal? That starts to explain why you have this marginal increase or no increase in overall revenue. You might also see fallout further on the doctor's schedule. Maybe when he was getting 30 new patients a month, if he sold a larger case, he could see that patient within, 3 days. Well, now with all this extra new patients, patient traffic, he's pushing people into next week or the week after. The service isn't as fast as it was before. So we're actually lowering internal quality by pushing this more traffic into the office, and that's where you get this lack of increased revenue. But sometimes what happens, and I've seen this a lot in the industry, I've seen it also in other industries, people get focused on one thing that stimulates growth as opposed to looking at the entire cycle of how the growth occurs, and they push that one thing and they don't see the growth that they expected at the end. Let's look at another example of this. Let's say you have a lot of inactive patients and you go, okay, I need to increase my hygiene because I have 4,000 patients who are inactive. You're a doctor and you're seeing, you have 2 full-time hygienists. You're working 4 days a week. You have 8 days of hygiene, and new patients go through hygiene, and you have a decent soft tissue management program, but you have 4,000 inactive patients. So that's a real problem. You need to get these inactives back into the practice. So you're thinking, okay, if I get all these inactives in, I have 2 days of hygiene now, and I should start to see more revenue. And you will see more hygiene revenue, but you won't necessarily see more doctor revenue. You might actually decrease doctor revenue at that point. We've talked about this in prior episodes, but there's an ideal ratio for doctor to hygienist in a practice. It's usually 1-to-1 or 1 to 1.5. So if you have 1 doctor day, you should have, really for every doctor day you have, you shouldn't have more than 1.5 hygiene days. And here's why. Let's say you have 3 hygiene days for every doctor day. You have 1 full-time doctor and you have 12 days of hygiene. What is this doctor doing every hour? In some cases, if every patient in the hygiene chair needs an exam that hour, they're having to glove and deglove 4 times to get back to the patient that they're with. Okay? The amount of time the doctor has to dedicate towards production, talking to patients about the treatment that they need, or what we might call sales, that starts to diminish. So yeah, you've boosted the hygiene production by adding that extra hygiene day or extra hygiene days, but you're actually reducing your ability as the doctor or the doctor provider to increase your productivity. You've actually lessened your productivity. This is law of diminishing returns at work. And I'll throw out a few examples because then you can start to think with how to fix this. Let's say new patients. Take new patients again. So let's say this has to do with new patient conversion. So you go, okay, if I want more new patients, I need to get more people calling the practice, right? So I spend this money on marketing, and let's say you've got this side of the equation figured out. You go, okay, if I spend X amount on marketing, I should get this many phone calls. And let's say you're averaging, 100 new patient phone calls a month, and you're seeing 50 new patients, which that's not bad. 50% conversion rate could be higher, but let's say you're seeing 50. So you go, okay, if I can get this number up to 200, I should get 100 new patients per month. So you do this, but you're not looking at the rest of what creates a new patient. Sure, you create the 200 phone calls with your extra marketing, but when a person calls, someone actually has to effectively and efficiently handle that phone call. And then on top of that, you have to have capacity to see these additional new patients. So when this doesn't happen, what occurs? You get these extra phone calls. You go from 100 to 200 incoming new patient phone calls per month. And instead of seeing half of them as new patients like you used to, you go from 50 to 80 new patients. So now your conversion rate is 40%. And you go, well, what went wrong? Maybe it's the quality of the new patient or whatever. It's not. You didn't increase the amount of time the person or the number of people answering the phone and handling these new patient phone calls. So what happens? The person answering the phone maybe has other things going on. They're having to put this patient on hold constantly. Maybe they were spending an average of about 8 minutes for every incoming new patient phone call, and they were able to get referrals too. A husband calls in, gets their wife to come. Wife calls in, says, why don't you bring your husband? So they're getting extra new patients that way, right? Because they could spend 8 to 9 minutes on the phone with each new patient. But now you've doubled the phone calls. They don't have 8 to 9 minutes anymore. So they're spending 4 minutes. So they're dropping or losing new patients that they could have gotten before. Then on top of that, you have a capacity issue internally. You used to be able to see new patients within 24 to 48 hours if that's what the new patient wanted. Well, now they're being pushed 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks out. So you end up with a ton of no-shows. All right. So you didn't expand it. You kept the other variables, the amount of time the person answering the phone had, the number of people answering the phone, the availability in the schedule. That didn't change. You just turned up the volume on the number of incoming calls. So you don't see that same conversion or revenue or new patient increase that you were expecting. And I've had this happen to me before. Let's say I have a big seminar and I go, okay, well, if I have X amount of people in a seminar, we usually convert, for the upgraded package, X percentage. But I know this, if I double the number of people in that seminar, just by virtue of doubling them, that is not going to naturally double the amount of production that I would expect from that seminar, because I don't have the number of people and the number of facilities it takes to handle that many people. Do you see? I could build to that point and I could build up to where I could do that, but I don't have it right this second. So just because I went from 20 to 40 people in a seminar doesn't mean I'm going to automatically double my production. It's not that simplistic. I wish that it were, but it's not. And the problem is, let's go back to this new patient example for a second. The person answering the phone, I could train this person, but they already weren't doing a bad job. They were converting 50% of the 100 calls that were coming in. And sure, training is going to help them, but an individual can only do so much, right? That receptionist needs 8 minutes per call, and they just don't have the 8 minutes. They can't pay the attention. They're giving them 3, and that's nothing any training is actually going to handle. So these are all examples. I just want to make it a bit more real of this law of diminishing returns that you see happen in dental practices, because we've seen it quite often. And really the solution to it all comes under the heading of organization and executive skills. And what I would do if you were looking to grow is you have to walk the whole cycle of production back from the final outcome. All right, it may sound a little weird the way I say that, but let's say, okay, what I'm looking for is more new patients. So how would I define a new patient? This is a person standing in my office ready to see a provider that has never been there before. That's a new patient, right? So what did it take to create that new patient? Well, first off, they've arrived, okay? They had to be scheduled to arrive. And then someone had to actually schedule them and spend some time on the phone with them. And I had to have somebody call the office. So if we walk this back, I have a new patient there. Someone had to schedule them. The patient had to call, or I had to get some type of a response, whether it was a form lead or something like this. And I had to have somebody whose interest I'd pique to the point they actually called my practice. Okay, so it's sort of 4 steps. Person is interested, they call or fill out a form. Whoever they reach or talk to is good at what they do, and they convert this new patient to show up, and then the patient has physically showed up in my practice. So what that tells you is if I want more people standing in my practice, that means that I have to increase all these other points. I have to increase the number of phone calls that I'm getting. I'm going to have to make sure that I have the facilities and the capacity to handle this number of increased phone calls at the same level of competence. And I'm going to have to make sure that when I schedule people, I have capacity so I'm not pushing them out 2 to 3 weeks so that they never show up. Because if you think about it, if you have a new patient no-show problem, right, it really depends on, there's a lot of circumstances that go into this, but if I'm a referral into your practice, let's say my spouse sees you, my wife is a patient in your practice, and she refers me to your office and we book an appointment. The fact that she referred me to the office gives me some degree of connection to you. I have some connection. I'm not going to necessarily want to search for another dentist because my wife already sees you and she's happy and you're going to be our family dentist. I have some degree of connection. There's, for lack of a better word, you could say even a small modicum of loyalty. All right. But let's say I find you by looking for dentists near me, or you come up as a Google pay-per-click ad, or I see you on Facebook, or I got your postcard in my mailbox. I have zero connection with you. So if I call your office, and let's say, because this is, now you can start to see, if you know the 4 steps of getting a new patient, you can see where it starts to go wrong. I call your practice. I saw your Google PPC ad, all right, or I got your postcard. So your marketing worked. I called you. Now, the person who answers your phone and schedules me is, let's take this. They could be really good, in which case they schedule me. That was the expected outcome. Or let's say they're not very good, or they're overloaded. They're having to put me on hold 5 times. At some point, I'm on hold for a minute now. I might just hang up. You lost me. Your marketing, at that point, you lost the conversion. But let's say they're good. So they get me scheduled. So far, so good. Your marketing worked. I called. Your receptionist, schedule coordinator, whatever that person's position title is, scheduled me. This all worked. But let's say they scheduled me for 3 weeks from now. I called, said, I'm new in town. I'm looking for a dentist. You go, saying, great. Or whoever answers the phone says, great. Well, our first available appointment is 3 weeks from now. I go, well, gosh, and, I'm attracted by the special on your postcard. I see I can get a cleaning, x-rays, and an exam for, I don't know, $140. That sounds good. And I'm willing to try you out. Kick the tires, give it a test run, right? So, I look, And I go, yeah, sure. I'll take that appointment 3 weeks from now. So I don't have a connection with you. Remember this? I have zero connection. So there's a really good chance that after we hang up the phone, if I really feel like I need to see a dentist, let's say my tooth's been bothering me, or I feel like my teeth look too yellow or dirty or stained, it's been a little bit since I've seen a doctor, there's a really good chance, especially if I've been searching for a dentist on Google, let's say I responded from Google, other dentist ads are going to pop up in, wherever I am or on Facebook, with these retargeting ads. So there's a good chance I may call another practice. So let's say I call another practice and they go, sure, we can get you in day after tomorrow. Well, that sounds great. And I look at their website and it looks like a nice office and it's actually just about as close to my house. I'm going to go there. So I may or may not call you to tell you that I'm not coming 3 weeks from now. As a matter of fact, most of the time with a no-show, it's not because the person's a horrible person. It's just, unfortunately, I think it's bad manners personally, but a lot of people do this. They'll book an appointment or they'll make a restaurant reservation and they're not going to show and they don't call. That's why some restaurants, especially higher-end restaurants, charge you in case you miss your reservation because people do that. Just interesting point. And this is sort of if you compare Canadians to Americans, okay? And I'm not trying to draw a weird conclusion here or whatever, but I just want to throw this out to you. I was talking to a company they have this analytics software for dentistry, right? It's also a contact management software for patients, sends them reminders and things like this. So I was talking to these folks, and they're based out of Canada, and they're in the U.S. market now. And in Canada, this software would send you a text. Let's say you're a patient of record. It would send you a text, and you could click the link. It would drive you to the practice's website, and then let's say this is for a hygiene appointment. It would let you book your own hygiene appointment. You could pick the provider that you want to see. Do you want to see Helen or Joan or Dave, for hygiene? Oh, I want to see Helen. Okay, you click Helen. Here are Helen's available appointments, right? And you could book your own appointment. So in Canada, when they had patients doing this, they would allow the patient to go directly on the book. All right, so I could get a text from your practice. I would see there's a link in the text, hey, Jeff, it's been a while since we've seen you for a cleaning. You're overdue. Click here to schedule. So I'd click. It would drive me to your website. A window would pop up. It would let me pick the hygienist that I wanted to see and the time slot that I wanted to see that hygienist. And you would walk in the next day. Let's say I did this at 9:00 at night. You would walk in the next day. I was on the schedule. So in Canada, they allowed that to happen because the no-show rate was under 20%. Over 80% of the patients that booked their appointments this way showed up, which that's not bad. So they rolled it out in the U.S. market. And I say this as an American, this is just part of the problem. Part of the problem in the U.S. is we are oversold to death. We're advertised to and marketed to everywhere to the point of, we're just beaten up about it. We're oversold. And it's part of the American thinking. I mentioned this before. My wife is Dutch. When we were in the Netherlands taking a little boat tour through the canals in Amsterdam, I'm noticing all this blank wall space in the canals that you could be putting billboards or banners up and wondering why they haven't done it yet. But we're all oversold, okay? So, and this even applies, we've marketed into Canada and we marketed into the United States. The laws are even different in the marketing. And in Canadian marketing, you're supposed to actually back up what you say, which I actually kind of appreciate. So if you look at MGE's marketing in the US and Canada, it's actually different because we have different rules we have to follow. Anyway, so they rolled this product out, this contact management, analytics software in the United States. And they started doing it initially like they did it in Canada, where, a patient would be able to book their own appointment on the book. What percentage of people do you think missed their appointment? Like, what was the no-show rate? It was over 75% in the U.S. The no-show rate was under 20 in Canada, over 75 in the U.S. So they changed their operating basis a little bit in the U.S. market to where I get your text saying I'm overdue. I click it. I go to the website. I pick the provider I want to see. I pick the time I want to see them. But my appointment's not on the book yet till you come in the following morning and accept my appointment, because they were running into problems with this. So especially when you're dealing with the U.S. consumer, you can end up with a little bit of fickleness on it. So if you're going to book a new patient 2-3 weeks out and it's off of a postcard or a Google pay-per-click ad and they have no loyalty built into your practice, you're going to end up with no-shows. So I'm just walking you through this. So you double the number of incoming calls, but you haven't let's say you have handled it so that people can actually handle the calls. You have enough people answering the phone and they know what they're doing and there's no drop off in quality when you go from one person to the other. Well, if you don't have capacity You haven't increased that variable of capacity, you could end up shooting yourself in the foot and not seeing the return that you expect. And then again, if you haven't expanded internally where you have sales time and diagnostic time and whatever, just like you did with the lower number of new patients, you're not going to see the resultant increase in revenue. So this tells you that if you're trying to expand, you have to look at everything connected to an end result. If you want more treatment sold, you want to be more productive. Well, take a look at where does production come from? Well, walk it back. Always walk it back and you'll see where you could get yourself into trouble as well as what the solution is. If I want to be more productive, what does that mean? Let's say I look at my incomplete treatment list and I have, $4 million on there. And I was, slightly perturbed because I had this patient. I really wanted to help them and they just didn't seem to understand. And they're going to go on a cruise, and I told them everything that they needed, but they're going to go on a cruise. They're not going to do the treatment that they needed. So yeah, it's also affecting patients' health. I don't like it. So I want to be more productive. So where does production come from? Well, before you can produce something, the patient has to accept it and make financial arrangements for it. And then before the patient can accept it, you have to be able to actually present it in a correct way where you have enough time to properly explain it. So let's walk this back. Patient in chair, you're ready to start procedure. This is the outcome expected of sales. In order to do that, I need to have them accept it and pay for it. And prior to that, I have to have time to explain it to them. And prior to that, I need a patient who actually needs treatment. Usually, most offices aren't short on patients who need treatment. There's plenty of that there. And, maybe you're the anomaly, but most offices, pull up your incomplete treatment list. There is a ton. So if you walk this back, if you want to be more productive and you're not as productive as you would like to be, you can see where this might be going wrong. Maybe you have patients who need treatment, but you don't really spend any time presenting it. Maybe when you spend time presenting it, you're not very good at selling it. And then maybe you're good at that, but your financial arrangements are terrible and nobody pays. Right? You see where this could go wrong. So if you're trying to increase an area, always walk it back from the final outcome and look at all the steps involved, because you're not going to increase it unless you increase all of these things commensurately. If I increase my phone calls, I have to increase my ability to handle said phone calls. I have to increase my capacity to see the patients that we're scheduling as a result. So then the question becomes, well, where do you start? It's sort of a chicken and the egg thing. Let's take new patients as an example. And by the way, if you want to know how to increase your new patients, I would recommend that you check out the MG New Patient Workshop. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. That's where we teach you all this stuff. But let's say I go, okay, well, I'm going to need more people to answer the phone. I'm going to need to open up time for that. I'm going to need to put in new patient blocks. I'm going to have to get another hygienist if you're seeing new patients through hygiene. So do I hire all those people first and do that first? Or do I start with the marketing? Well, it really depends on how confident you are in creating the increase. Okay, let's say you're really confident. I know if I do X, Y, and Z, I'll get an extra 30 new patients a month. Well, then by all means, start putting the infrastructure in place to handle these 30 extra new patients per month because you're confident you can just get them. Let's say you're not confident. Well, then, okay, start with the actions that you think may get you the extra 30 new patients a month. Prove it out for yourself, and then you will have the downside to this is you might have a couple of months of inefficient operating, but then as you start to see those new patients ramp up, you need to hustle and put the infrastructure in place to be able to handle these new patients. You track with this? So it really depends on your level of confidence. I would apply this to anything. If I'm adding hygiene days, I would take a look at where am I going to max out and when do I start needing to look for an associate. Now, do I start looking for the associate now? Well, it really depends. If associates are easy to find in your area, maybe not. If they're harder, you might want to take some time because, you might find somebody who needs to give a month's notice where they are. But then again, that depends on how confident you are in ramping up your hygiene department. Do you see this? These are all issues of organization and the ability to be an executive, right? Which, look, if you have questions about any of this stuff or you're going through a growth phase, or anything along those lines, you can always give us a call here. We're happy to talk to you. You can get a free practice consultation. I'll put a link for it on the episode webpage. We can kind of sort through this stuff with you so that you can grow confidently. Anyway, I hope that helps. I hope it at least gets you looking at if you are looking to change or expand an area, because you can apply this concept to anything. Walk it back from the end result and you'll start to see the points at which it could go wrong, as well as the other points you would have to expand commensurately with the other points so that you end up with more of what you want, whether it's new patient, hygiene days, or production. Anyway, folks, that's all I have for you this week. If you have any questions about MGE, you can find us online at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Have a great week, and we'll see you the next episode.